Good afternoon, everyone. This is Danny Haifong. I am joined with Margaret Kimberly this afternoon, and we have a very special guest today. And before we get to our special guest, I want to just direct you to hit that like button now while you're here, as you're coming into the stream. Subscribe to the channel, all of that good stuff. Hit that notifications bell. And get ready for a great conversation, because today we brought in someone that we respect very much, and that is Erica Caines. Hi, Erica.
Hello, everyone. Peace, peace.
Yeah, Erica, would you like to talk a little bit about your work, what you've been up to before we get started with the conversation?
Yeah, well, I am a coordinating committee member of Black Lions for Peace. I'm also a co-editor of Hood Communists. Locally, I'm a member of Ujima People's Progress Party here in Maryland. And I also facilitate and run Liberation Through Reading, which is a book gifting program for African children. So that's about it.
And so you mentioned Hood Communists, which is a great publication everyone should check out. But Hood Communists, you wrote a great article for Black Agenda Report that I'm actually going to pull up on the screen as you talk about it at the end of March, about the new McCarthyism. And Hood Communists has come under some pretty heavy censorship. This has been a conversation that's now reached, I feel, more and more ears. More people are talking about it because of Russia's military operation in Ukraine, and all of the ways in which independent media, anti-war voices, anti-imperialist voices across the spectrum are being censored and pulled off of platforms. But this happened to Hood Communists quite a while ago. Could you talk more about that? And I'm going to, in the article, I'm going to pull it up now.
Right. The day actually that the article was published made a year that Hood Communists was put off of Twitter without any reasoning. Like, we never got a heads up on why. We just were deleted, permanently suspended. We like to think that the reasons that we were permanently suspended was at around the time there was a lot of conversations around imperialism, third worldism, and we were very much deep involved in those discussions and discourses that were happening. Getting people excited and knowledgeable about Pan-Africanism, about the work that the blog is doing. We were pushing consistently organize as a consistent message, which inadvertently caught some backlash on Twitter. So a lot of the reasons, we never got an official reasoning, but a lot of it obviously had to do with our politics. And I say that to say that I was not on Twitter. I had not been on Twitter since 2018, because I was suspended as well, permanently. I was suspended during the prison strike. I was very active in tweeting about that, and I also got inadvertently caught up in what was happening in Nicaragua, which I got a wash, like a wave of backlash from right-wing Nicaraguans behind that. And then I was instantly removed. I tried to maybe come back, and then they found me again and kicked me back off. And then I just gave up on Twitter, and I haven't been back on since. But Hood Communist has officially been off for a year.
We this is a reprint of what you had written on Hood Communist. And you have your website. You also have a Telegram channel, right?
Yes, t.me/Hood Communist. And twice a month we hold PE chats with our readers. So we have general discussions around, like the last one that we had was on Palestine. We talk about African liberation. We try to get people more. We have one on NATO. We just try to make sure that the readers are not just reading, but they're engaged. They, they have some clarity on what's being discussed in the blog, and that, that we're real people, we're real organizers. So we are attempting to organize people around a sort of political education through the Telegram. And it's also the best way that you can find our articles now that we are no longer on Twitter.
Yeah, I urge everyone to go on to Telegram. It seems that everyone who's kicked off Twitter ends up on Telegram, although I have to say none of these platforms are safe.
No.
There are, people who get kicked off of Telegram. So we have to use these platforms as for as long as we can, while we can, because they are a great resource for reaching people. But on the issue of censorship, this is painted as the censorship is being pushed by liberals, actually, contrary to what most people think. The corporate media will always amplify someone on the right who complains about censorship, but it is liberals who are pushing this. And the targets, they make it seem as though the target is Alex Jones or someone who planned the January 6th Capitol riot or something like that. But the target is actually on the left. The targets are actually on the left. Last week or a couple weeks ago, the Biden administration instituted the Disinformation Governance Board under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security. And we're told that they're going to fight against Russian disinformation. Now, I personally am not concerned about anything the Russian government says or Russian media say. Plenty, you can comment on what they say. What's the problem? But it is a problem, but it's a problem for liberals and not a problem for conservatives. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So I will say for sure, I think one of the reasons that I wrote the article is because when By Any Means Necessary took a hit, it made me, it made my, my ears perk up, because for a long time, Ajama Baraka has been saying that we are following behind nonsense with censorship for a very long time. He's been laying it out clearly that there are liberals driving this, or like he likes to say, the latte left, that are behind this because they have significant issues with the right. So their resolve is to just shut them out. But it's not actually shutting out the right. And what the By Any Means Necessary showed me is that months prior to that, there was a whole lot of hoopla about Joe Rogan and people wanting Joe Rogan off Spotify. And then everybody was, threatening to pull their things off of Spotify if Joe Rogan was on. And then obviously Joe Rogan is still on Spotify, but then By Any Means Necessary gets snatched. So it's not really about any sort of pushback about what's being the particular politics, but it is a pushback on what's being said and how it aligns with certain things. And I think that when Jackie Lukman talks about the Russiagate, how it set us up perfectly for this, it did. It absolutely did. Because I would like to think that Hood Communists being put off of Twitter is also a product of that, because a lot of that censorship started to erupt around that time. Like, I've been called a Russian bot on Twitter. I've been accused by journalists actually being Russian bot. So these things, I think the Russiagate set us up perfectly for people to not even blink or think twice about that sort of censorship, because they're wanting it. They're asking for it. So they don't see any need to be alarmed by the amount and the way that it's being done, and to who it's being done to.
Yeah,
definitely. Just for those who may not be familiar with that great show, By Any Means Necessary, which is on Sputnik, and Sputnik shows were all kicked off of these various platforms, and they were still on YouTube until a snitch, and this is a new wrinkle, we have journalists snitching on other journalists. So someone under the guise of finding out about Russian disinformation informs YouTube, did you know there's one last Sputnik show that you didn't get rid of? And kicked By Any Means Necessary, co-hosted by Jackie Lukman and Sean Blackman, a great program on which we've all appeared. But so we can see that the state is very, very serious about closing off discussion. and silencing anyone who will not repeat their official narrative. And as you point out, it all Russiagate it all began immediately after the 2016 election. That Trump was a Russian agent, a Manchurian candidate, something or other, and there were efforts, prop or not, propaganda or not, popped up, put Black Agenda Report on its list of offending sites. Sites began losing viewers. It was harder to get attention. So this is something that had started some years ago, and now with the war in Ukraine has sped up. And Barack Obama has reappeared. Well, he never really does go away, does he? Talking about disinformation, giving major speeches about disinformation, and asking for censorship, but being Obama, not coming out and actually admitting that's what he's doing. And then this disinformation governance board pops up. So this is it's getting real, isn't it?
Right. And to your point about liberals, like I remember, I think it was Tanashi Coates accused Barr of being Russian bots too, for that article. So it's like it's a thing that liberals were doing. I think that any criticism that you gave about the Democratic Party, it got you aligned with Trump, and then it got you aligned with Russia and Putin. You know, they were setting him up to be the most evil man ever. And I think that anything that's said against that or pushed back against that, if it's not labeled Russian affiliated or Russian state media, then they kind of group you in with that, so that it makes it easier because nobody questions it. I mean, the whole concept of Putin being the pinnacle of evil, right? That's not questioned at all. At all. I mean, it logically makes sense to people. Without knowing any details, any facts, they just take all these things in. So what's happening, what we're seeing now is that, you know, hood communists, I don't want to say that it disappeared with no fanfare. There were people that, you know, we did have a lot of support, but it's still a small blog, right? So it never came back into the same extent as a lot of these maybe European bloggers or European journalists that have been taken off, and then campaigns have been pushed for them, and they are back on Twitter. That was never the case for the communists. So that's you know, that's why I always fixate on paying attention to who it's actually um, affecting, because it's one thing to call out the McCarthyism, but I think that in that vein, we have to remember the Red Scare era definitely targeted Africans. Um, so that's what we're seeing happening now, because I do find it, because you know, people are getting taken off, but they're also getting their pages back. So it is something to pay attention to who is and who isn't getting their pages back, and what's the circumstances of that. Because I think that in itself is another issue. Because what does that censorship mean? Where there could be campaigns in a sense, and some of those campaigns are recognized, and some of those campaigns are not.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true that there is this, you know, there's obviously this broad campaign, but and I like to think about it like this too, is that, you know, oftentimes how this is framed too is that it's like the horseshoe theory. It's like anyone who's outside of the establishment narrative gets targeted. But wherever the right wing is, they're always growing, right? They're always growing on all platforms. They seem to have the access, the connections, the capital, all of it to get by. But it's people on the left, especially the Black left, especially people who are talking about kind of just like these subjects that are completely and utterly red baited and smeared and sort of McCarthy out of the conversation. Foreign policy, imperialism, white supremacy, all of that's I feel like that's who gets targeted, and then who really doesn't come back. I mean, they're the as you said, hood communist has not been allowed back on Twitter, and that's a huge problem. I wanted to, there has been this now, I feel like escalation in this. Now people on PayPal are getting taken down. We know that, I mean, the Daily Beast came after me and a whole bunch of other people trying to take us down from everything. Like they were showing our content and saying this violates the standards. I wonder if you could talk about the history of censorship, because you went over in the piece, right? You went over a bit of the history. And could you situate where Black people, Black America, Africans, where do they center in this? Because it's often not talked about in this way. I feel like there is this almost avoidance of this issue, right? We hear a lot about Julian Assange, and we should uphold Julian Assange, but not a lot about political prisoners. Could you talk about this, I guess, situating the war on Black people into this conversation about censorship? Because you did it so good in the article.
Right. Yeah, because I'm a much better writer. But no, I will say that a lot of this has piqued my interest. I think from the time that I started investigating socialism, Marxism, that's a common thing that you see, especially since my entire introduction to it was through Africans. So I opened the piece, of course, with Claudia Jones, because I think that she's probably the most infamous case of McCarthyism. Well, her and Paul Robeson. But I think that Sharice Bernan-Stelly, I leaned on a lot because she has a great piece. I think it's Scoundrels in the Times of Peace, when she talks about W.E.B. Du Bois and his and the McCarthyism that he faced and the silence and censorship that he faced. But I think that this is a common theme. I mean, the other Blacklist is a book that I've read that specifically talks about the ways that the Red Scare targeted Gwendolyn Brooks and Paul Robeson, like the entire literary aspect of the Black left was targeted under the Red Scare. The Un-American trials. So there's a history of Black people who are seeking liberation, who are seeking, who have anti-capitalist, socialist leanings, who may even consider themselves communists, which is a little difficult, because now I understand clearly why people were not so outright willing to say they were communists, even though they were often at those Communist Party meetings, and you could probably put two and two together. But I think a lot we see that when as Africans start to make a road for self-determination in this country, they are not just silenced, but they are severely repressed. And that surpassed the Red Scare, because one could argue, and I think it has been argued, that COINTELPRO actually started with, trying to combat the Communist Party and the labor movement and such. But it continued through the Black Panther Party, through the Black Power movement. And those are aspects of silencing as well. So this has been an ongoing thing in Black liberation, where state tries to shut down any trajectory from the smallest to the biggest scale of Black liberation. And I think especially when we look at what they've done with the Panther Party newspaper, the way they try to shut that down, like any form of communication. I think there was even a law that they passed that I noted. Hold on, let me get it specifically. That speaks to what we're seeing now. Yeah, the Subversive Activities Control Act of 1950, which is
Right.
the McCarran Act. So what we're seeing with the Russian state media is the same similar tactics that they used then for organizers and people on the left. Right? Anything that you were mailing or shipping needed to be tagged with your organization so that people would be aware, that they can give a heads up, like this might not be legit because it's with this org. That's the same kind of thing we're seeing with the Russian state media, like that sort of, or even the Chinese state media now. And they're actually just tagging that on anybody. It's indiscriminate. It's not There's not any sort of rhyme or reason to it. Like when you look at the details of how do you decide that this is Russian state? It's not clear at all. It's just like they just decided. But a lot of these things that are happening are not being pushed back on because they are being, like you said, Margaret, they are being allowed through with liberals. And I do think it's very fascinating that it was a journalist that went after BAM, and it is journalists that's going after smaller, left-wing media, because the Daily Beast, like when you all posted the questions that were asked, it's like, why would anybody answer those questions? And then not answering them right now, obviously you're a Russian bot.
Yeah, it's a catch-22. It's like the witch trials, and they said a witch would float in the water. So if they threw you in and you drowned, they said, "Oh, you weren't a witch." But if you managed to survive, then you were. So you would only be innocent if you were dead. But that is, this is going to be happening more and more because, and it speaks to also to the state of journalism now, which is in a very precarious position. Their media consolidation given to us by Bill Clinton, a Democrat. They always get a Democrat to do these things, of course. Has limited the number of outlets, and as neoliberalism increases its in strength, and they just farm out everything, right, to work for the state. So you have journalists who work for the state. So years ago, you might have had the Pentagon Papers, and newspapers would compete with one another to expose things the government didn't want you to know. But now we have journalists who go out of their way to work with the state and represent state interests. And that makes it very difficult to get reliable information. That's why we have to use these platforms as much as possible, because the world of journalism, and I want to say journalism with air quotes, has been turned upside down. But I wanted to ask you if you could expound on the point you were making about who gets censored, who really gets hit with the hammer, and the fact that Black radicals are treated the worst and censored the most. Why do you think the Black left is seen as a greater threat than others on the left?
There was something I just read in I'm reading Detroit. I do my dying, and there was a quote that he said in there, where it was just basically that if Black Americans were to organize ourselves in a way that we could liberate ourselves, we would be liberating the world. And I think that probably is how it's viewed, I think, by the state, that they understand that sort of power. And I think that's always been the scare and the fright, because that's why they break up internationalist movements. That's why they interfere with them. I think the fear has always been that if Africans in this nation found self-determination or found some semblance of it, that it would then inspire the world, right? And I think they've always tried to put a muzzle on that as much as they could. But then also, what does it mean for this nation if Africans do find self-determination? Will there still be a nation? So I think they really definitely go after the Black left more intentionally, more intently. I think that there are people on the left that, I don't even want to say the Black left more intently, but I do think that it's with more intention. I do think that they are very intentional about the ways that they do, suppress and repress the Black left, because of the magnitude of power that it could possibly have. And I think that, having witnessed the organizing through the decades, the state is very aware of the capabilities that we have if we were to organize in mass and get our shit together. So I think that as more organized sectors of the Black left are in these spaces where they can awaken people who are not so much, they may be aware of their circumstances because the contradictions are only getting sharper and sharper. You can't not be aware, right? But they may not have the language, or they may not understand where they can go. And then you have like a hood communist on Twitter saying, organize, organize, organize. Pan-African is the only way. You know, Africa, once Africa's free, we're all free. That's an intimidating, so, you know, and then people are flocking to that sort of messaging. That's a type of intimidating sort of thing. So yes, I think it's not just communists, right? But I think that when that type of language of liberation and self-determination is coming out of the mouth of Africans, it definitely makes the state react.
Yeah, we already saw some of that. You know, in the 60s, it was our liberation movement, which led to benefits for all of society. There would be no Medicaid or Medicare without the mass movement carried out by Black people for our liberation. So I just want to say we've already seen that. So yes, that does answer the question of why the threat is considered greater.
Yeah, and the political aspect of this, I think, is interesting because oftentimes, and it's not, I mean, I wouldn't say it's incorrect. I don't like the term free speech. I think is very loaded, but that tends to get the emphasis here, is that this is a huge violation of free speech, First Amendment, all of that. But I think by just focusing on that, it kind of dissolves and minimizes the political significance of this repression, because it's not just a matter of we just can't say the things we want to say. There's a direct attack on resistance, on any kind of resistance to empire, to white supremacy, to to capital itself. I mean, I think that is often not discussed. Even talking about Julian Assange, it's like, yeah, Julian Assange uncovered war crimes, but it's like, what do those war crimes tell us, right? And why would there be such a huge backlash to even him just doing what he did, which seems pretty basic, just releasing information that was made available, right? That should be made public, should not be a secret, and really isn't a secret, right? So could you talk about the politics of this? Like, what exactly is the establishment so afraid of? You said self-determination of Black people. I think that's 100% correct.
Right.
What is the state so afraid of? Why are certain voices censored, and others who maybe consider anti-establishment, they seem to be doing okay?
Right. Well, I think we can look to Mumia still in jail, right? Sundiata Acoli is still in jail. When we look at the voices of the people in the time that they were around and what they were projecting and the messages, I mean, we obviously, Julian Assange journalism has been significant, but also Mamiya's too. And Mamiya has been able to write and teach consistently from behind those bars, behind those walls for decades. And I think that when we look at, he's aging, right? We just celebrated his 68th birthday. He's aging in these jails. Why wouldn't they bring him home, right? Primarily because of the message. What does it mean if Mumia comes home? What does it mean if Sundiata Acoli comes home? Right? And I think that that's what we have to understand when we're talking about political prisoners, when we're talking about the intent of the state to remove, repress, suppress these histories that are within our political prisoners. So I think that when we understand those basic concepts, we understand those basic things, we understand more why the state moves the way that it moves. What are these people saying? What have they done? And Margaret, I just wanted to ask one thing. When you were talking about Bill Clinton, were you talking about the Telecommunications Act?
When I was talking about
Bill Clinton, were you talking about the Telecommunications
Yes,
Act?
yes.
See,
Yeah,
I'm trying to. It's been a little side pet project of mine. I'm trying to understand the political climate of the '90s, particularly like the early to mid '90s, late '80s to mid '90s, because I think a lot happened.
yes.
That the left in general just kind of kind of grasped over. But I think in terms of what we're dealing with now, especially with culture wars and all those things, I think that there's a lot of I wrote about it in Hood Communist recently, but I do think there's a lot there that we just don't really look into and unpack. But the Telecommunications Act, I think for sure changed the way that not only reporting is done, but how we even receive information. So it's a lot easier to deceive people. And I think right after that was what the Yugoslavia and all of that happened. So we never were really given the real details of anything post 96.
No,
and
we
then
weren't. It was
the framework of talk radio took off, and then Fox became a thing. Yeah, so I think like I think that's a significant part in time that people just kind of skim over. But I think that's something that we really, especially as Africans, really need to look into, because a lot happened in the 90s.
Bill, I'm glad you brought that up. Bill Clinton was one of the most right-wing presidents in modern times. He, not the so-called welfare, so-called reform, from the time of FDR, from the 30s until I think it was 95 that they passed this so-called reform, you had a legal right to seek public assistance. And this reform program threw millions of people into deep poverty. And that was with the Democratic president. And they get away with these things with Democrats. That's why they occasionally want a Democrat in office. But before the Telecommunications Act, you could not, for example, own a television station and newspaper in the same city. So Rupert Murdoch could not buy the New York Post and also have a TV station until Bill Clinton came along. So there is a lot to unpack. It was, looking back, I was not, frankly, as smart as I am now, not as aware as I am now, to see the great damage that was done to the country under this man. And this belief that the lesser evilism, and the late Glenn Ford always said the Democrats aren't the lesser evil, they're just the more effective evil. And they get a lot of dirt done when a Democrat is in office. So this the media consolidation, there used to be hundreds, there used to be thousands more radio stations, TV stations. Now there's 6 corporations that control what you see and hear. And this is very dangerous. And you're right. It means that you don't see the lies. It means that the window is smaller and smaller and narrower. So there used to be, even in corporate media, I'm older than both of you, so I can remember when there might be pushback from a TV network, pushback in the New York Times against a state narrative, and now they're just spokespeople for the state.
Yeah, and I also want to just add that I was a kid in the late 90s, and so I didn't really understand necessarily the political climate, but it wasn't good. I mean, it was not good, and I think there was a lot of glossing over. It felt, personally growing up and then knowing what I know now, it had this feeling of just this like glossing over of US criminality. Like the United States at this time, Bill Clinton really helped to push forward what I think Obama put to the extreme. This, like, the Democratic Party was this party of like progress, despite this general trend of to just like the apocalypse for so many people. But there are people, I remember even growing older as I started to figure these things out. I had people growing up in my community saying like, oh yeah, Bill Clinton, he was mostly good, and he was mostly for peace. Like, we didn't have any wars at that time. And it's like, Bill Clinton was bombing Somalia, bombing Yugoslavia. I mean, it's just an absolute lie. There was plenty of wars. The military budget increased just like it did any other time. And there also was that sinister Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC, which was the kind of like the body that consolidated the sort of quote unquote conservative Democratic Party apparatus, the Wall Street establishment that now dominates. And so the 90s were a very challenging time. Yeah, and people, NATO, and you had
that's terrible.
all of it. You had the crime. Now people will say, okay, the crime bill, right? Because there was more enthusiasm during the Hillary Clinton campaigns, pointing out, oh, look, as what Margaret said, welfare being destroyed, and all, and then you also had the crime bill and all of that, and then the 96 anti-immigrant legislation, all of that now people can talk about, but rarely do you have it come together as sort of a consensus on that period. And I think part of that to me is when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the US really went in, and part of it was the consolidation of the media, the narrative of this is all that there is no alternative. So even if things are getting bad, it's progress if you have, I don't know, quote unquote, you don't have as big of a deficit, or these little things, taxes are a little bit, they're not as bad for middle income people. It's some, there's all these little things, but the general trend was, there is no alternative. So, so you get what you get, and this is all that there is.
Yeah, I do feel like the Soviet Union fell, and then like this nation got like more right wing, like it just like doubled down on it. And I think a lot of that, like when I look back at the Phil Donahue or the Sally Jesse Raphaels, like when I'm watching those clips, and you're seeing that the doubling down on, and it's basically a fight for the soul of America, or things like that, like the future of America. So like when I hear like "Make America Great Again" or "Build Back Better," and this language, because I think Biden even said recently he wants to save the soul of America, and all of this is like right wing language that was coming out of that era of the early 90s. And I think that by not engaging the 90s at all, we're missing the ways that all of it is seemingly being repeated. I mean, where we're at right now with Roe versus Wade, where we're at with these issues that are being called culture war issues, so that they don't have to address people-centered human rights at all. Like a lot of that was then. So and even to the point of censorship, because the Telecommunications Act, I think, allowed for so much of what we're seeing now. In addition to Russiagate.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. And in '91, when we were told, even people on the left weren't astute enough to see the dangers of a Soviet Union disappearing in a unipolar world. People said, we'll get a peace dividend. That's what we were told. If there's no Soviet Union, then we don't need all this defense spending, and this can be used for the people. Of course, the exact opposite happened. It was an opportunity for the U.S. to increase its hegemony around the world. And you mentioned Yugoslavia. As now in Ukraine, we keep being told that this is the biggest war in Europe since 1945. Well, that's just not true. Under Bill Clinton's leadership, NATO destroyed Yugoslavia and broke it up because it was an independent socialist country. So this is, and unless you remember, it's very frightening to me, unless you personally remember these things, you can just be fooled. Or people who don't think about it think, oh, that's true, no wars in Europe since 1945, when that's simply a lie. There was a war. The U.S. did bomb Yugoslavia, did break it up into smaller nations, and it was a U.S. NATO effort, and it was actually led by Bill Clinton. So that's what makes our work so important, because otherwise history can just be disappeared. disappeared by the corporate media. People can read in the newspaper, no wars in Europe since 1945, when that is simply not true. And that, I guess, answers our question of why censorship has become such a priority. But I also just wanted to talk about the Soviet Union. You know, the little bit that we do get in, or did get in this country, the little bit of a welfare state that we had, it was to make people believe that they should not be on the left. It's like, well, look, well, you know, you've got this in America, you've got that. And with the Soviet Union being gone, they didn't have to do that anymore. They could just, there was more austerity, less of a reason to do anything at all. So it does all come together.
Yeah. And I think with the censorship that we're seeing now pertaining to Russia is because of the histories that they're trying to diminish. Or like my mother, you know, obviously I always talk about this. My mother watches MSNBC. So this is how, excuse me, this is how I'm able to stay up on what's being said and what's not being said. And I think I put this in the back slap, but I did send a video because I recorded it. Like I had to rewind it on the DVD or the DVR and catch it, because what was being said was that there are people claiming that there was a coup in 2014, and because of that alleged coup, you know, that set the groundwork for what we're seeing today. So they try to make it seem like this is just something people are saying. There's no legitimacy to it. People are just saying these things online on the internet. Now, if they keep cutting off the people who are saying that online on the internet, that are saying that back with facts, with resources, they can link you to it. They can say, "Hey, I was here at the Odessa protest in D.C. when it happened." They could just cut all those people off and just block them out, and then none of those things could be said, right? So, if all the people who are saying otherwise to mainstream media could just be cut out, is there now a otherwise? Like, is there now another, another report to be made? Is there anything else to say? If MSM is telling you that there has not been a coup in 2014, and they're saying it repeatedly, and here are all these smaller left wing or like non-mainstream media outlets saying, no, there was a coup, and here's the pictures of the coup, and this is how many people died as a result to that, and this is what happened in the Donbass region, and they're having opposing views, then the U.S. can't continue lying about this coup that never happened. And as you could see, they kind of stopped lying about the coup. There's only so much you can, it's only so many lies they can tell, right? But if they cut off all the people telling the truth, it doesn't matter if they're lying, because it's only one narrative. It's the same thing with the Nazis, right?
Yes.
They keep showing the Azov Battalion everywhere and telling us that's no. These are
they're tiny. They're very small. There's only about 300 of them.
They have to retract what they've said, because the New York Times would always refer to the Azov Battalion as a neo-Nazi formation, and now they call them just far right. So they have undone their own words. But to the 2014 coup, what is funny to me, a diplomat, so-called, Victoria Nuland, who was in the Obama administration, is now back with Biden. She and the rest of the incompetent team. She was recorded. She was yakking on an unsecured phone, talking about who she wanted to be the prime minister of Ukraine. And this was recorded. It is, you can find it anywhere, but that also speaks to why the lies are so important, because there's evidence of that the U.S. was saying, screw the EU, she said, I want this guy to be the prime minister. And lo and behold, didn't that guy become the prime minister? So there was a coup. Yes, the U.S. was involved. They bragged about it at the time. Joe Biden was the Ukraine point person. But that's also why they distract us with so much, because the last thing they want is, because that was only 8 years ago, the last thing they need is millions of people to remember and say, wait a second, I remember Victoria Nuland. Newland's phone call. But I wanted to also let people know. I'm changing the subject a little, but I want people to know why they should read Hood Communist. And we're always looking for good stuff at Black Agenda Report. We have original stuff, but we this week we reprinted an article from Hood Communist. It's an interview, a Jamu Umi interviewing a man named Mukasa Dada, who I'm going to admit I'd never heard of. He was a leader in the SNCC and the man who may be responsible for us knowing the words Black Power. So I urge people to Wednesday's Black Agenda Report Day, blackagendareport.com. And we have this reprint of this interview from Black Power to Pan-Africanism with Mukasa Dada. So your Hood Communist does great work. And I just wanted to amplify that so that people knew to look for it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to the prior subject. I pulled the article up. I'll put it in the chat. I also put the Telegram link a while ago. I hope people got that to Hood Communist, the website, and whatnot, all in the chat. But and while you're here, of course, keep liking the stream. Keep sharing it around. That's how you get it seen in these tough censorship days. But to the point of the Azov and the Nazis and how they're so small and what the media, how it's being whitewashed, the whole Russia-Ukraine situation has been whitewashed. But what's hilarious to me is I think there's like 2 points. It's the corporate media. I mean, it's so consolidated. We're talking about the Telecommunications Act. There's like 6 corporations that own all of it. And yet all of their correspondence, despite this tiny number that they have going to Ukraine and literally seeking supposedly just anybody, they keep on accidentally running. Like, I don't think they understand. There have been many instances where it didn't seem to even be understood. I think there was a PBS interview to a mayor out in Ukraine who the background was blurred, so they definitely knew that that there was, I think it was Stepan Bandera in the background, but then you had Richard Engel, right, going to this so-called like training ground, and there's like old, elderly people, young people, like kids learning how to shoot weapons, and they all have the Azov regiment insignia on them. So it didn't seem Richard Engel at NBC knew what he was getting into, and I think that should give us some indication. To me, it's like if in the 60s, a U.S. journalist were to go parachute into Vietnam and try to speak to the peasants, they would probably find a whole lot of, NLF fighters, right? They'd probably find a whole lot because they're everywhere. And that's what it seems like in Ukraine, where the journalists, they're not trying, a lot of them are not trying to just find these forces, but because they're embedded in the military and because these forces are the most emboldened, they are they are really the ones who are leading the charge, and the media is not afraid to say that. It's just that there's this constant campaign to whitewash them as just merely these like patriotic forces who, I love this one. CNN does this all the time. I feel like they have an article every week about this. They've decoupled their politics from the military. Once they were embedded in the National Guard, then they let go of their politics. But when they start cleaning bullets with pig's blood so they can shoot Chechen Muslims, then and they'll publicize that on Twitter, on the National Guard's Twitter account. But their politics are completely divorced from from their fighting, what they're doing in Ukraine. So anyway, I just want to point that out. But anyway, Erica, I'll kick it back to you.
No, I think it's a mess, really. Because I think that it all of that speaks to why voices like myself and you all have to have some sort of repressive element, has to be repressed, because it's not being talked about, not in any serious ways. I mean, the whole idea that Zelensky, there couldn't be any Nazis because Zelensky is a Jew, it really speaks to where we are collectively. because that's such a drastic misunderstanding. I know people like to say, well, Obama's black, and look how much he did for black people, and I think that that's a great example. But then, what do you think Zionism is? Like, I'm so like, I was like, even if he's a Jew, right? What do people think that Zionism is, or how do people understand or interpret Zionism, especially when we're seeing what's happening with the Palestinians, especially when we hear Zelensky say that he wants to make Ukraine another Israel? What exactly do we think that he is saying and speaking to, that would make him not in any way sort of align with Nazis? I think that sort of confusion is evident when you see that kind of response. But then also, I'm thinking, is there like no investigation anymore with journalists? Like I don't think that I'm particularly a journalist. I did run the high school newspaper, but I don't consider myself a journalist. I didn't go through the rigorous training. I don't have any degree for it. But I damn sure research, and I feel like that's what's left, because I think that anybody who just does a little bit of research would not be able to stand in front of the camera and lie. But if you know nothing, then sure, they could hand you anything. But I don't think there's any investigative reporting happening anymore. I think that the field of journalism, or the school of journalism, does not actually encourage independent investigation. So I don't think that anybody coming out of those schools are encouraged to independently investigate. And if there's a narrative that's coming from the top, and it's their job to just repeat that narrative, then I don't see why any journalists would want to ruffle the feathers, especially when we are seeing, mainstream media pundits are getting paid, what, 25 million a year, etc. Shit, I lied too. 25 million.
Well, I wanted to say a couple of things. Of course, you're a journalist. You don't have to get paid to do it. You don't have to have gone to journalism school. You report the news. You provide news and analysis. So that makes you a journalist. If you look at what they do you have more reason to call yourself a journalist than the crap you read and hear in corporate media. But and to your point about Ukraine, the entire thing is just a gigantic scam. Ukraine is a kleptocracy from top to bottom. Zelensky was put in office by an oligarch named Kolomoisky, or Igor Kolomoisky. And it's very funny to me. I've been saying this for a while now. Every negative thing they say about Russia is actually more true about Ukraine. Ukraine is completely run by oligarchs. Putin, on the other hand, kicked oligarchs out of politics. And Kolomoisky was sanctioned by the United States, by the State Department. He robbed his own bank. It was one of the biggest heists in history. He was buying up property in the U.S., and I think that's why he was finally sanctioned. So it's very convenient. It's easy for them to say, well, and he has a private army. Rich people in Ukraine, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Gentiles, they all have these fascist groups as their muscle. And that is something that is quite easily provable as being true. But no, they don't investigate. They're not paid to investigate. They're paid to support the state. They're paid to support our oligarchy here. Yes, we have one. They are paid to uphold the rule of capital. They're paid to uphold billionaire rule. And that means they cannot tell the truth. Assuming they think about it that much, to your point, they are not going to do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so many layers to this. I think that, this information war, right? There's it is so many components. I mean, you have the repression of people like us, then you have the repression of political activity too. I mean, that's one thing that's often disconnected, is that throughout even this recent period, even just the quote unquote, like the Black Lives Matter umbrella, like a lot of activists just in that milieu, even with the just simple demands for police accountability and the things surrounding it, we had activists disappearing. You had people who were, on the ground, just gone. People like Darren Seals and others, they disappeared and then they ended up dead. And so I think there's so much connection to this information war, to like the actual imperatives of, as Margaret was saying, the rule of the rich and the rule of capital, and white supremacy is like an integral tool to keep this up. And censorship, it can't be disconnected from that, because you can see that the lines and the contours of it thread it all together. Really, it really shows a pretty clear picture for us. But yeah, Erica, if you want to have any closing words, we're probably going to wrap up here in the next 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say, to your point, right? We also seen that with the scientists. There was a massive worldwide mobilization of scientists, right, or for climate change. That got a blip in the in mainstream media. The man who did his protest act when he lit himself on fire, that got a blip in the media, because I think that they don't want to highlight certain things, because then it would get people questioning, asking, right? And I think that the contradictions, like I said earlier, they're becoming too sharp to ignore. So people are fully aware of their material conditions, regardless if they have the language for it, or if they have the community around them that could support any sort of organizing activity they might want to engage in, because they now understand their material conditions, or because they know their material conditions. And I think that we see a lot of that happening. Like, we cannot just look at the repression solely on one angle, right? If we understand, like we said earlier, it's the oligarchy. I like that Deruba calls it a garrison state, right? Because I don't see it any other way. If you have militarized police coming to attack scientists in white coats, that for protesting or trying to make noise about what's happening to the climate, that says a lot about the country, but it also says a lot about what is being protected, right? We even talking about with Ukraine, right? Ukraine is a neoliberal catastrophe, and all of this money we keep sending to Ukraine, I hope folks are aware that they are holding Ukraine to that. So whenever this is all said and done, Ukraine is going to have to figure out a way to pay all that money back. It's going to be another Afghanistan situation. So they completely, between Zelensky and NATO and the EU, they could, like, it's a catastrophe over there. But I think that the non-engagement or the inability to engage the actual truths about what's happening there is a lot of why the censorship is happening. It's a lot of why the impeachment was pushed so hard for Trump. People were asking far too many questions about Hunter Biden and Ukraine. So we see the way that the state is going to protect itself at the expense of its own citizens. So I think that's something that we have to be mindful of, especially in any sort of organizing. If we understand the utility and the purpose of policing is to protect property, then we surely need to understand that as the labor movement continues to grow, as more people look to unionize and strike and do wildcat strikes, the police are going to be involved there just the same. It's going to be repression tactics just the same. We see that happening with the Starbucks CEO now, right? Those are tactics of repression. Those are tactics of censorship. Those are tactics of McCarthyism that we are seeing just topple the working class right now, because we're not organized enough to combat it. But I think that even with the removal of these mainstream outlets, so long as we stay connected in our organizations, I think the one of the more significant things about Hood Communists is that while it did take a hit for being put off of Twitter, because we are all established in organizations, whether it be the APRP or Black Alliance for Peace or the Low Country Action Committee, we were still able to get the word out, get the news out about what was being reported on the blog. So I think that being established in organizations helps us as as independent journalists, as independent writers, as people who want to get this information out with a purpose of organizing our people, it does help us continue that purpose, because so long as we don't own any of this, because I know people always say we could just build our own, but even with the case of Rumble, right? We all understand who controls Rumble. So so that's we have strange bedfellows these times makes. But but I say that to say that when we see what happened with Press TV earlier last year, the way that the U.S. can still snatch servers, we have to be a little more considerate and more mindful about the ways that we talk about building and creating our own spaces, especially where we understand where a lot of the capital for these things are coming and why these spaces are allowed to thrive where others wouldn't. And what is the political trajectory or the political lane of the space that we want to build? Because those are things that we could always have our own space, this plethora of them. But is it a space that is building capacity to organize and liberation, and building capacity for people to understand their material conditions? So if that's the type of work that you're engaged in, then you should definitely be prepared to be repressed in some way or the other by these platforms that we do not own, that are privately owned. And I think, as long as your work connects directly with the people, there will always be an audience in spite of what the state tries to do. So I think that's what we've learned in this year.
Yeah, well, I mean, this has been a really great conversation. I pulled up the Hood Communist website. I think I shared it in the chat, but I can share it again so you can definitely follow their work. But it's no better time. You brought up the word ownership many times, and I think that's a huge question. It's no better time to be a communist than now. We talk about ownership.
Right.
And where we're at with that, and how that affects everything, and it's affecting our capacity to just do the media work that we need to do, which is of course going to be, and it always has been, a critical component to developing strong social movements, strong movements of resistance to oppression. So Margaret, do you have anything you want to add before we head out?
Just
go ahead,
No,
Margaret.
Erica,
you go ahead, Erica.
You can
I
come back
forgot.
too.
Also, I know we mentioned the Telegram, but a lot of the PEs that we do on the Telegram is put on Hood Communist Radio, and that's on SoundCloud and Spotify. So the interview with Mukasa Dara is on Hood Communist Radio as well.
Great. Thank you. I don't have much to add. This was a great conversation. Thanks, Erica, who is a loyal listener. She usually would be in the chat.
Yeah,
here with
appreciate
us.
that. It's amazing.
But I thank you. Today is Black Agenda Report Day, blackagendareport.com. And Danny has his Patreon up there. And check us out. Look for us everywhere. Thank you all.
All right. Well, it was good, Erica. We'll definitely have to have you back another time. But yeah, we're going to end the stream here. Catch us again next time by subscribing to this channel, hitting that notifications bell. Give a like before you leave here as well to this video to keep boosting it. But definitely hit that notifications bell so you know when we go live. And peace out, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.